In a world where superpowers still believe they can dictate who eats and who starves, one man chose to say no. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso blocked the United States' demand to import its soybeans, the world barely noticed. But what followed would quietly shake the foundations of a $124 billion global trade empire. For years, Africa's agricultural system had been shaped by external forces. Loans from the IMF dictated what could be planted. Aid programs decided what should be eaten. And massive agribusinesses from the West reaped profits from African soil while local farmers struggled to afford their own harvest. In this system, control wasn't held by governments or farmers. It was buried deep in trade contracts and global supply chains. So, when Traoré refused to reopen his markets to U.S. soybeans, it wasn't a simple trade dispute. It was an act of rebellion against decades of dependency. He called it a matter of sovereignty, the right for Burkina Faso to feed itself first. For Washington, it was a provocation. For the Sahel, it was a signal. Behind closed doors, the numbers were staggering. The global soybean trade had become a lifeline for U.S. agribusiness, worth over $124 billion a year. Much of it flowed to Asia. But Africa represented the new frontier, a continent where imported soy was marketed as development. Yet the real development was happening in fields that no one was watching. Under Traoré's directive, Burkina Faso began investing heavily in local cooperatives. State-run programs offered microloans to rural farmers to grow indigenous crops and soy hybrids that thrived without foreign fertilizers. Instead of importing processed soy meal from Iowa, Burkina started producing its own. It was small at first, just a few pilot farms outside Ouagadougou, but the results were undeniable. Productivity rose, costs fell, and for the first time, profits stayed within the community. Across the Sahel, people were paying attention. The movement wasn't loud. It was steady. Farmers began pooling resources, building local silos, and forming independent supply chains that bypassed the usual international brokers. The shift was subtle, but powerful. Control was moving back to the soil. In diplomatic circles, whispers grew louder. Washington dispatched envoys. Reports warned that Burkina Faso's decision might inspire other nations to follow suit. Some described it as economic nationalism. Others called it agrarian populism. But to the people living it, it was something simpler: survival. By mid-year, Burkina Faso's economy began showing early signs of stabilization. Inflation slowed. Food prices dropped. The agricultural sector, long treated as a relic of the past, became the engine of the nation's recovery. Traoré's message spread quickly. Africa will no longer export hunger. For decades, African nations had exported raw crops and imported finished goods. Soybeans were crushed, processed, and repackaged abroad, only to be sold back at a higher price. Traoré's policy flipped that cycle upside down. Local industries began processing soy domestically. The value chain stayed home. The global market noticed, and it did not like what it saw. Powerful interests moved quietly. Lobbyists called for sanctions. Analysts warned of instability. But the more pressure came, the more Burkina Faso leaned inward. The state strengthened partnerships with neighboring Mali and Niger to form a regional agricultural bloc focused on self-sufficiency. What started as one country's resistance was turning into a continental strategy. Burkina Faso's rejection of U.S. soy wasn't just about economics. It was psychological, a refusal to be dependent, and the symbolism ran deep. For decades, Africa's leaders had signed trade deals written abroad. Traoré's signature was different. It was a signature of refusal. He wasn't promising wealth. He was promising dignity, and in a continent long stripped of control, that promise meant everything. By the time Washington realized what had happened, the storm had already spread. Burkina Faso's embargo was no longer a local act of defiance. It was a continent's quiet awakening. Trade ministers in Tanzania, Kenya, and even South Africa requested briefings on something called the Burkina model. What began as a rebellion of one country was now being studied as a roadmap for all. inside Burkina Faso, the transformation was visible. Military engineers once trained for war now built silos and irrigation lines. Old barracks became cooperative offices. The same trucks that once carried soldiers now hauled grain. The country wasn't militarizing agriculture, it was reorganizing survival. At every harvest festival, Traoré appeared quietly, dressed in simple fatigues, speaking not of politics, but of soil. He told farmers to grow, to store, to share. No grand slogans, no fiery speeches. Just calm conviction that food, not aid, not money, was the foundation of sovereignty. For the first time, children in village schools ate lunches made entirely from local ingredients. Soy flour from Bobo Dioulasso replaced imported feed in livestock farms. Women's cooperatives began selling nutrition bars across the border to Niger using the new agri-credit system. Each small victory was a declaration that independence wasn't an idea, it was a harvest. But the more Burkina Faso thrived, the more the global system pushed back. Development aid offers were quietly revised, trade credits tightened. International banking platforms began delaying payments for security verification. It wasn't open aggression, it was the system defending itself. Not with guns, but with spreadsheets. In Washington, the pressure grew. Lobbyists linked to the Soy Export Council demanded action. They called Traoré's embargo an agricultural insurgency, threatening billions in American exports. Trump's advisors urged diplomatic intervention, economic persuasion, if not outright pressure. But there was a problem. Burkina Faso no longer fit inside their leverage map. No IMF loans to freeze, no U.S. trade programs to suspend, no military bases to threaten. Just a small, landlocked nation operating quietly, independently, and successfully. The more Washington tried to analyze it, the less it made sense. How could a country so small with such limited resources shake the world's largest agricultural empire? The answer was simplicity. Burkina Faso didn't attack the system, it left it. By late September, the African Economic Sovereignty Bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea, launched their first joint project, the Sahel Food Sovereignty Compact. Its goals were simple. Each member state would reserve a portion of its grain for regional trade, invest part of its defense budget in agricultural logistics, and label all locally grown produce under a shared identity, Sahel Seed. Within weeks, the results began to show. In markets across the region, people began buying local, not out of politics, but trust. Tomatoes from Guinea, peanuts from Niger, soy cakes from Burkina, all marked with the same label. Grown in the Sahel. It wasn't just trade, it was transformation. And in those crowded markets, something profound began to grow: pride. Western media struggled to understand the story. Some called it agrarian nationalism. Others described it as populism in camouflage. But inside Africa, no one used such terms. They simply called it normal. Because for the first time in a generation, Africa was feeding itself. Still, Traoré's defiance didn't come without risk. Urban elites began to worry. Imports were limited. Foreign investors were uneasy. Critics warned that the economy could falter without Western credit lines. But instead of silencing them, Traoré invited them in. He ordered a full public audit of the agri-credit system, with both local and international observers present. When the audit passed with transparency intact, it silenced even his harshest skeptics. Burkina Faso wasn't operating on faith, it was operating on accountability. Then, in early October, something remarkable happened. 3 AES member states, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mali, announced the creation of AFROP, the African Food Reserve Organization Program, a regional grain stabilization mechanism built not by the World Bank or USAID, but by Africans themselves. Each country pledged a share of its strategic grain stock to a decentralized reserve, governed by local agricultural councils, not politicians. For decades, Africa had been the recipient of food aid. Now it was building its own safety net. Burkina Faso pledged first 3,000 metric tons of soybean oil processed entirely within its borders. Guinea and Mali followed within a week. It wasn't grand in quantity, but historic in meaning, a self-funded, self-governed continental reserve. In Washington, the news barely made headlines, but in the fields of West Africa, people knew what it meant. For the first time in living memory, no one was waiting for shipments from across the ocean. They were storing their own. At a televised town hall in Ouagadougou, Traoré faced a panel of farmers and students. When asked what his goal truly was, he answered simply, "The point is not to leave the global system. The point is to stop being trapped in it." That phrase echoed across radio stations, classrooms, and walls across the Sahel. It became a national mantra. By November, the Burkina model was no longer theory. It was practice. Soybean prices stabilized, rural employment rose, food prices dropped, and something even more powerful began to take shape: belief. Belief that Africa didn't need to be saved, it only needed to be trusted. His final address that year wasn't from a podium or a conference hall. It was from the shade of a neem tree. No teleprompter, no notes, just a man speaking to his people. He said, "The world will forget headlines, but the land remembers what we plant." That line became more than a quote. It became a promise, painted on walls, written on grain sacks, printed on oil bottles. A promise that Africa's soil, after decades of exploitation, would finally remember its own strength. Burkina Faso had not waged war against America. It had simply stopped surrendering. And in doing so, it sparked a quiet revolution, one not driven by ideology or vengeance, but by dignity. The $124 billion soybean trade war wasn't about crops. It was about control. And for once, control had shifted not to corporations, but to farmers. Not to boardrooms, but to fields. Not to Washington, but to Ouagadougou. In a world built on dependency, Ibrahim Traoré planted something radical: independence. And from that soil, the Sahel began to grow a new kind of power. One that no embargo could stop, one that no deal could buy,